Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the FOREVERNESS podcast project. We are very excited to have with us today Professor Mr. David Gunkel. David is an award-winning author, educator, and researcher. He's specialized in philosophy of technology, with a special focus on the legal and moral aspects and the challenges of artificial intelligence and robots. And one of his last books, his last works, is a person thing robot, in order to establish a new set of rules, a new set of rules of the game, which will allow us to create a society where humans and automata, to put it this way, could coexist and cooperate in peace. Would this be correct, David? And a follow-up question: which values or points or points of view could be those?
So I think what's interesting is that we come to these sorts of dilemmas. What the status of an automaton, like you describe in your work, what that would be. And I think we inherited a number of sort of categories that we get from Roman law, which is you're either a person or a thing. And in fact, if you look at most legal systems, not just in the West, but across the globe, they are divided up into a way of categorizing things as being either a subject of the law, a person, or a thing, which is an object of the law. Now, persons have rights and responsibilities that we have to respect. Things are stuff we own, right? They can be bought, sold, utilized as we see fit. That has been in existence for a good 2,000 years, and it has worked fairly well, both in moral philosophy and in legal decision making. But I think we're bumping up against things that are straining against those boundaries. And AI, robots, other automata are things, obviously, because we manufacture them, but they play roles in our social world that go beyond what we recognize as a mere thing. And so one of the questions people are asking is, okay, so what box do they belong in? Do they belong in the thing box or the person box? And you have different theorists and legal advocates saying there are things, others saying we should open up the category of person and allow for AI to be persons. And I think the real problem here isn't the AI, it isn't the robot. The real problem is our categories. This binary categorization of things is really limiting. And if we're going to look for other ways of organizing our reality, not only can we look within the Western tradition to see some other ways of organizing the entities in the world, but also in other traditions like Confucianism, like Middle Eastern philosophy, like Japanese philosophy, where we have other ways of categorizing the entities that we exist alongside that are a little more open to a wider range of possibilities. And really what I try to do in the book is tap onto these other resources in human thinking and human history that will allow us to create a little more resilient and flexible set of categories for dealing with our future.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we would look a little, or we could find some inspiration in Confucianism, in some other Eastern beliefs, or those would be examples, no? Or at
They are,
least
yeah.
they're a bit more open in that
So
regard.
it's just, again, it isn't because those ways of dealing with these questions is somehow better than what we do in the West.
Of course.
It's that they're different.
Mm.
They have different ways of breaking up the world of entities into different kinds of units that are, for us, maybe a way of opening up our way of thinking about these things. So just to give you a really interesting example, in some indigenous traditions in both North and South America, these categories are not very rigid. They're more flexible. And so, for example, a child's toy in some indigenous traditions is considered a thing when it's sitting on the shelf. But as soon as the child is playing with it and interacting with it, then it's something different. Then it becomes something more than a mere thing. And there you have some entity that moves across that border based on the engagement it has with the human population that is involved in interacting with it. And I think this gives us a little better understanding of some alternatives for how we can respond to some of these new artifacts like AI and robots and how we relate to them. So I don't want to suggest for one second that we should just ditch everything we've done in the West and find other ways of doing things. I think there's ways of using the differences between different cultures, different ways of thinking, different religious and philosophical traditions to help create a more responsive set of categories and ways of thinking about the different entities in the world. And this doesn't just go for AI and robots, it goes for animals, it goes for the environment, it goes for mountains, for water, all the things that we are trying and struggling now to deal with regards to the climate crisis and trying to find protections for things that we had exploited because we thought they were things. But now we want to develop a little better sensitivity to our shared kinship in this very fragile world that we share. How do we live together and create a better and more robust sort of moral and legal framework for the future?
Absolutely. I came curious once you explain that example. I don't know. Maybe you don't have to know an example, but do you know of examples of these cultures where these entities, like for example these toys, they may have a different some rights sort of recognized to them, assigned to them.
Yeah, so the rights question I think is a really important, but it's also a complicated question. And it's complicated because rights aren't a singular thing. Rights are pretty complex. There's in rights literature, we talk about natural rights, which
Hmm.
are the sort of those God-given rights that we have as living creatures, and then there are legal rights. And in the way that we use the word rights, we sometimes slip from natural to legal and back and forth without knowing where that boundary is. So just to give you a good example of where this can create some trouble for us, if you say, for example, a corporation is a person and it has rights and responsibilities, you're not saying that the corporation has a right to vote or a right to marry or any of these other things. You're saying that in our legal structure, we want to recognize the corporation as a subject of the law so that we can sue it and we can hold it responsible for bad outcomes, and that the rights and responsibilities that belong to the corporation are legal rights and not natural rights. And I think when we're talking about artifacts, if we're going to do anything in the area of rights, I think it's going to be more on the legal side of the rights question than on the natural side of the question. There are some people who argue for natural rights for robots and AI, but I think that gets into the territory of AI consciousness, super intelligence, and things like that. I think well before that ever happens, we're going to have to solve the questions of we live with these other kinds of things that are not things, and how do we fit them in our social reality? And the way we fit them in our social reality is we take existing law and we make it apply to these new entities. And therefore, right now in the US, we have robots that have rights. And the reason why we have robots that have rights is that in 12 states in the United States, we've decided that robots operating on the street have the rights of pedestrians. Now, that's a really minor, tiny right, but it's really important because it helps us resolve conflict if there is an accident in which one of these robots is being hit by a car or vice versa, where is on the street and operating among pedestrians and traffic. And so the courts and the legislatures that have made these decisions aren't trying to figure out like big, like science fiction type questions. Are robots persons, or are AIs, needing welfare and things like this? It's just how do we make these things work in our world in a way that fits our legal and moral expectations? And so rights is one way we do that. And I think really being careful about how we use that word is crucial to helping us understand what the opportunities and challenges are.
Absolutely. There are some challenges, I believe, no, with that regard, of course. Like for example, in the European Union, it's been like at least since 2017 or even earlier that there has been at least projects to make regulations about this. And I read that there are like different postures, no, from scientifics, like
Yeah.
some part of the scientific community want these rights, not rights, but yeah, want the law to be mindful of this new reality. And some of them, of course, they also want law to be mindful of this, but with a different perspective, no, whether they can be held accountable directly of some of their actions, or or whether it should go in a different way.
Correct. So in 2017, the European Parliament proposed a new category, not person, not thing, but electronic person. And that was going to be a new legal category that applied to robots and AI. And the goal here was really quite impressive because they were trying to get out in front of a problem. They were recognizing that automation could potentially displace a lot of workers, and that if a lot of workers are displaced, you're not having people pay into the social security systems, which are the safety net that we rely on as a population ages and people need to collect their social security benefits, et cetera. So one of the goals in creating this new category of electronic person is that if a corporation replaced its human workforce with robots, which is kind of a science fiction scenario, but that's kind of the direction they were thinking,
Yeah.
you could tax the corporation on the wages that those robots would be receiving. And that could go into the social safety net through taxation. It was a pretty clever sort of strategy, but the scientific community was absolutely up in arms about this. And there was this very famous open letter that a lot of AI scientists signed. And you can't do this. This is just wrong. And it killed the entire idea. But inevitably, as you can all already anticipate, this is not the first or the last time something like this is going to be tried. It's going to need to happen because the existing categories of person and thing are not adequate for us to be able to respond to the new challenges. And that is going to require some reworking of our legal categories to be able to respond to these changes that we're going to be facing with increased and integration of these technologies in our world.
So, David, I'm curious because from what is we're looking at something that's going to be practical. So the question is not if, but when,
Yeah.
right? So, and these practical regulations, like what you're talking about, pedestrians in the streets, are going to be taking place regardless, because the damage to society, if they are not implemented, is going to be bigger and bigger, because the impact of automata on our society is also growing. So there's this strictly legal debate that is going to grow. But what I found interesting from your book and about the deconstruction using other ways of constructing the world, like that other different. How easy it is such a change in mindset? Do you think it's even possible for Western people in one generation or so to actually deconstruct such basic way of approaching the world? Is it, you think it's feasible? Because, and before I hand over to you, because the question of legality is one, but the question of moral and ethical values stays there. I mean, I think it's, and I think when you talk about the book about how slavery is pernicious to, and this is to the masters, like, we don't want to be there. So all the moral issue needs to be addressed. So how do you see this coming about? Like, people changing their mindset in such a fundamental way. It's
Yeah.
like, I'm going to see the world in a different way. What do you think? How?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question because as human beings, we are very set in our ways at times, and breaking out of traditional ways of thinking is often a big ask that we struggle against. But I think if we look at the history of moral progress in the last 200-300 years, I think we see some hopeful signs. So, for example, at one point, Europeans that came to the New World where I live looked at the people who live here as things. And basically exploited them, enslaved them, killed them, robbed them, and did not treat them as equals to themselves. It took us a couple hundred years to come around to the fact that these other antipods, as they were called, right, the people on the other side of the world, or the the slaves that were really captured in Africa and then sent to America to work in the American South and in Brazil and elsewhere. It took us a couple hundred years to sort of figure out that no, indeed, these people also are people and therefore have the same rights and the same respect required of them that we give ourselves. But it does take time, and it takes often more than one generation for this to transpire. We see something very similar with the rights of women. Women were considered the property of their husbands, not until, really the 19th century, really the 20th century, do we begin to erode that and recognize women as full citizens and full persons with the right of self-determination over their own lives and give them the vote and things like this. And then animals, right? For the longest time, animals were considered raw material, and it justified not only the captivity of animals, but the slaughter and the processing of their bodies to feed us, to clothe us, and do other things, create products. And the animal rights movement in the late 20th century began to erode that way of thinking and open up our minds to this idea that maybe the difference between us and non-human animals is almost negligible, and it's much closer than we ever thought it was. And there may be a reason to open up the rights of animals the same way we did for enslaved people, women, etc. So I think, we see some progress over human history, but we shouldn't discount the fact that that progress comes with the cost of time and blood. And this is something that, if we could avoid, would be really very prudent on our part. If we could learn from our history about how we progress, we might be able to make better progress in moral progress than we have in the past.
Do you know the expression to throw a curveball?
Yes.
Okay, I asked because it comes from cricket, and you're not normally very familiar
Same
with
with
cricket.
baseball, so
Okay, I don't know. So I'm going to throw you a curveball, which is going to hopefully, I think, completely change the civilized conversation that we're having so far. So when in all of these changes in mindset, there is eventually a breakthrough where the individual breaks through this reification, objectifying the local population, the women, children, and then of course you break through, and then there's moral. What singers, the expanding circle, like we include them into our category, and I'm gonna present you a character that comes from the FOREVERNESS novel that can help us, like, ask the whole question in a completely different level. So we talk a lot about transhumanism, understood as people uploading their consciousness into the cyberspace, right? So in a computer or in the cloud or whatever. So people are thinking I could extend my personality, not extend, but sort of, project my personality into a software entity, and then that'll be me, and they'll be immortal. That's the first question that we can address. What's your personal opinion on this? I'll go further with this, but do you think it has does it make sense to you? Do you think there's any continuity between the individual that is the source of the experience and the entity that is the receptacle where the experience is going to be?
So let me come at it this way. I'm fascinated by the uploading of the consciousness, right? I mean, there's a lot of science fiction that plays with this. You get people like Ray Kurzweil, who thinks it's not science fiction and it's going to be absolutely possible in 50 years or 40 years, depending which week it is. He changes the target, but he thinks it's going to happen, right? And we're going to be able to do this. And it's not just Kurzweil. There's other people who have this idea that we could achieve immortality by exiting the flesh of the body and then putting our consciousness in the clouds or the cloud. One of the things that worries me with this thinking is that this is just really solid, good old-fashioned Cartesianism. I mean, this is where Descartes really begins modern philosophy by saying, okay, there's the mind and then there's the body. We call it dualism. And the mind and the body, at least in Cartesian dualism, is separable, and that these two things can be broken apart. We also have a version of this in Christianity with the soul, which departs the body, leaves the body behind, and lives in immortality in the heavens, right? So there's something very theological and religious about this way of thinking. And it's very much connected to the Christian tradition, but also the Cartesian dualism that breaks the mind and body apart. And I think one of the things that complicates the upload is what if what we call mind isn't something that's separable from the physical container? And what if mind is as much in this thing as it is in this thing, right? And there are some philosophers who've been working on, sort of this more integrated understanding of consciousness that is embodied consciousness, that is not separable and is non-Cartesian. But we also have in non-Western traditions ways of thinking about the human being and human consciousness as something that is not easily broken out into these two Cartesian different substances, the thinking substance and the physical embodied substance. So whenever I think about the uploading of consciousness, I'm always reminded by the sort of history of this way of thinking. And it is a very strong Western understanding of how we relate the mind, the body, the soul, the body in our tradition. And I think there's ways of challenging that, which I think would open up some other avenues of inquiry and help us to see that maybe this is not anything beyond a myth that we've given ourselves, an ideology that we've created, that we can somehow separate the mind from the embodiment.
Yeah, it would seem, I mean, according to many philosophers and scientists, the biogenesis of consciousness, so it's a result of life, not of information. Many scientists are inclined to this. Where our first guest, one of our first guests, Paco Calvo, who's the author of Planta Sapiens, is much more likely to have consciousness in plants than there is in software entities. That's his approach after working. Anyway, so we have this question: is it feasible at all, right? But going into the moral hypothesis. Now, let's imagine this software entity where I have uploaded my conscience takes over, so is uploaded to a physical robot, anthropomorphic robot.
Yeah.
Says, oh, it's PJ, it's me. So how do we deal with this? And this is your curveball. How do we deal with a net software entity that says, I am a human, I happen to have a metal body?
Yeah.
So yes, yeah, great.
I think we can, like, putting the human consciousness in a robot body sounds like science fiction, right? And so obviously it plays well.
It is. Yeah.
It's something that, we've seen in a lot of science fiction. But I think we already have in reality right now, in science reality, versions of this. We just don't recognize it as such. And I think one version of this is the brain dead individual. So in the case of a brain dead individual, their consciousness is somehow gone and their body is still there and alive. And the question becomes, how do we treat it? Is that body just a thing, or is it a person? The other place that you see this happening is with the fetus. When does the fetus become a person? And this is the question that, all the abortion debates run around. And there's a lot of guesswork. 3 months, 6 months, the day it's born, from conception on. And it's because we really want to know when the consciousness enters the body. And it doesn't necessarily work that way. And that's the
Mhm.
struggle we have. It's this, again, this binary way of thinking that it's one, it either, the fetus either is or is not a person. But the fetus is a very liminal thing. It's very much in between person and thing. So the way we resolve this right now is we say, well, the brain dead person, we still treat like a person because they were a person. The fetus, we treat like a person because they are capable of becoming a person. So we take this current way of thinking and we apply it to the robot with the human consciousness in it. You can see how people would say, well, the robot now is a person because the consciousness that's in the robot was a person and now is in a different form. And therefore, we would carry over that same way of thinking into the robot body. You would have other people, I think, who would be on the other side of this debate and saying, no, that consciousness is now in a different body. That changes the rules of the game, and we can do whatever we want with the robot. And I think this is how this debate is going to play out. And this is where I think we look at exactly what's going on now with liminal cases, edge cases, fetuses, brain dead individuals, and use those as sort of templates for helping us figure out how we will likely respond to the uploaded consciousness.
Going back a little bit, it's just, of course, mentioning some of your work, like personhood in the age of biolegality, or an introduction to communication and artificial intelligence, robot rights, or how to survive a robot invasion. Obviously, all your work is it's quite extensive and related to these topics. How did you first get interest in the intersection between
Yeah.
philosophy and technology?
So I think from the beginning, I was interested in philosophy and technology, mainly because when I was a graduate student, I paid my bills by being a web developer. And
Mhm.
so I was working directly with technology on a daily basis and then studying Derrida, Hegel, and all this other stuff in graduate school. And when I graduated, I realized that there was, at that point in time, really early 90s, a real need for some good theoretical work on this new thing we called the internet. And I was in the right place at the right time with the right set of skills, and was able to sort of plug into that and write very early in the development of internet studies some of the pivotal works in that field. But eventually, the internet gets to be a bit boring. We start to figure it out. We integrate it into our everyday lives, and it's not the new thing on the block. And somewhere around the 2005, 2006, I realized that I got to start looking at where the next big new thing is going to be, and that's when I pivoted to doing AI and robots. So that for me was I could already see what was happening with connectionism and neural networks, and looking at how that was going to open up AI in a way that would reinvigorate the field. Because prior to that, we'd been through that expert systems period of time, and we had this AI winter, and people would talk about AI, but they would never use the word AI anymore because it was considered kind of a bad word. By 2012, we're out of that winter, right? And the stuff is exploding. So that's how I got into it, sort of very practically. But I think more with regards to my sort of reasons for finding it intellectually important, I think a lot of people working in philosophy and AI are doing what I would call applied philosophy or applied ethics. That is, taking what we know from philosophy and using it by applying it to the challenges and the opportunities of AI to help us figure out the new social direction things are going. And I do some of that. But I think more interesting for me is I think AI and robots open up a whole lot of interesting ways of doing philosophy. So for me, the challenges that AI bring isn't just an opportunity to apply existing values to these new technologies. It's a way of questioning our values. It's a way of doing what Nietzsche told us to do: reevaluate all values, and come up with new questions to be asking ourselves about human exceptionalism, about who is in the moral circle, what is outside the moral circle, about these categories that we've created for ourselves. And I see this technology as really a tool for doing some good philosophical reflection. And not just apply philosophy to technology, but apply technology to philosophy.
And which role would you say that philosophy it's currently playing in a world where more decisions are being delegated to algorithms, or what's your aspect, your point of view on this?
So I'm going to pull a on the one hand, on the other hand kind of thing on you. So on the one hand, it's really good that I think at this moment in time, people developing these very powerful algorithms are looking around and saying, we need some help figuring out the moral challenges of these technologies. And maybe the philosophers have something to say here. And so you are seeing major corporations like Google, like Anthropic, like OpenAI actually talking to people who do ethics, and wanting to hear from them. And I think that's very valuable. And I think that allows for philosophy to have a very in a very public engagement with this technology and what it all means. On the other hand, this is the more negative side of this. I don't know that it is doing enough to really help us understand new ways of doing philosophy. I think we're looking at philosophy as a sort of way of answering a bunch of questions. And once those questions are answered, we're done. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye. I think we're missing the opportunity to do this other part of the relationship that I was talking about, where we allow the artificial intelligence and the robots and the automatons, et cetera, to provide us with some ways of doing philosophy in much more interesting ways of not only answering questions, but opening up new forms of the questions that we've been asking, new avenues of inquiry, and new methods of investigation. So I think it's a mixed bag. We see some very positive things, I think, with regards to the way in which philosophers can play an active role in shaping the future of our engagement with these technologies. But I think we are perhaps missing some opportunity to actually allow for this to have a really much more radical impact on the human project.
How do you think, in which ways we could use these opportunities to create these, not philosophy, or yeah, or maybe to rethink the ways that we are doing philosophy, or the way we think about the world?
So I'll give you a good example from the more recent innovations of large language models. So we have large language models. They use statistical probability to string words together, to make interesting texts and engage us in conversation. And the debate about these things, both within the industry and within the academic fields like philosophy, is that, well, they're using words, but they don't know what they're saying. They're bullshit machines. They're not responsible for any of the content. They produce hallucinations and bias and all that sort of stuff. And yeah, that is all correct. But we're missing, I think, the way in which the large language model tells us something about our languages that we didn't see prior to this. So instead of just seeing large language models through the lens of traditional philosophy of language, philosophy of technology, there's a way in which we can use the large language model to pose some very crucial questions about how we've been doing philosophy of language, what we've been thinking about through philosophy of technology, and as a result, open up some other avenues for thinking about what language is all about, why language works the way it does, and provide some other ways of thinking about thinking in general. What it is that we say we're doing when we use a word like thinking, what it is we say we mean with a word like consciousness. And I see the large language model as creating a really great opportunity for us to have a much larger conversation about some of these bigger philosophical questions, as opposed to just an application of philosophy to technology.
So there's something that I find slightly worrying, I suppose, is that from my perspective, what I see is that it's not ethical considerations what's driving progress, but financial benefit.
Yeah.
And then when, of course, all these large corporations have ethical committees, and from what I know from philosophers that work in the field, they are is maybe a bit more of a showcase than an actually. If the decision is we think this is morally preferable, but this is going to produce 3% increase in income, then decision's already made, right?
Right.
So what needed, what needs to happen? What do you think needs to happen before, or can it potentially happen that we say, okay, this society needs to have some beacon for our future well-being, I suppose. That will be, I mean, understanding ethics in the purely Greek sense of the word, right? That's
Yeah.
how we live our life. Like when this concept of what a more ethical society, a more ethical technology. So what needs to happen before ethics overtakes benefit, or can it happen?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I think it is incredibly naive to think that multinational corporations are first and foremost thinking about the moral impact of their developments of technology as opposed to the bottom line in making profit. But this is not new, right? I mean, what we think is an AI problem is really a capitalism problem.
Yeah.
And we have to look at the ways in which our expectations for moral responsibility in multinational corporations hasn't been a very good experience through the 19th and the 20th century. And I think it is naive to think that just having the developers of these technologies talk to philosophers and ethicists is going to change really anything. And I think the cynic that the sort of more cynical position you've articulated, that this is just ethics theater, is very possible. We hire these people and put them on our boards in order to make it look like we're helping think about these big problems, but really we're worried about how much our percent increases for this fiscal year. So how in the past have we dealt with this? How have we reconciled ourselves with the need for profit in the multinational corporations sort of way of thinking about the bottom line as the be all and end all, and on the other hand, social responsibility, which is the moral ethical question. And you can see, we had similar questions during the time of industrialization. The new Pope Leo said that he sees AI as being very similar to industrialization in terms of the pressures it puts on us, in terms of our way of thinking about our societies and our moral responsibilities. And so he chose the name Leo because the last Leo dealt with the Industrial Revolution. And this Leo is dealing with the AI revolution. I think the place we have to go is we need to look at not the corporations to self-regulate themselves in such a way as to behave more ethically. I think we're talking about more robust policy and more robust regulation of multinational corporations. Because if indeed this is a good old-fashioned capitalism problem, the way you solve a capitalism problem is that you have a third party checking and balancing the books between the population and these multinational corporations. And who can do that? Governments. And they do it with policy and regulation.
Have you thought about in which ways could governments actually apply this, not only make this policy but also apply this policy? What would be, because it wouldn't be just a normal committee or commission or group
Right.
of experts. It's like it would need to be with a lot of structure and a lot of process and thought into it. How would you do something like that, or how would you propose something like that?
Again, this is a mixed bag. So on the one hand, the sort of more negative, cynical look at this is that lawmakers tend to be older people, tend to be not tied into the new technology. And therefore, their ability to make laws for new technology tend to lag. I had a lawyer friend say to me that technology advances at light speed, but law advances at pen and paper speed. And it's always playing catch up. But if you look at how we regulated for the internet, it was not a very smooth operation. I mean, it was very uneven, it was very bumpy, and it has taken us quite some time to even regulate the internet. And some people would argue we never really did a good job anyways, that the existing regulation is still not strong enough to protect individual persons and their communities. And I think, again, this is the more cynical way of thinking, but if you look at the way the laws are being made right now for AI, who do the governments call in to talk to them? In the US in particular, the people at the table are not you and I. The people at the table are the CEO of Google, OpenAI, Anthropic, and Microsoft, and Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Sam Altman. They're the ones that have the ears and the attention of the lawmakers. So you can bet they're going to be asking for regulations and legal policy that is more friendly to the industry than it is to you and I as consumers and users. So I think if we're going to get this right, we have to do democracy better. We have to have all the stakeholders that are involved in this having a seat at the table and able to talk about it. And I don't think we've done a good job of that either for the internet, and I don't see us doing a good job of it right now. But if we can create a circumstance where individual stakeholders beyond just the major corporations are able to have input in the process and shape the development of these policies and these regulations, then I think we have a much better chance of things turning out well for the way that we integrate these technologies. I also think it would help us if we look to other nations as guides. I think oftentimes we think what we do in the EU is so much better than what they're doing in China and the US, and we don't do a lot of cross comparison except to say that we're right and they're wrong. If the Chinese come up with a really good regulatory scheme, looking at that and learning from it is not a bad idea. Just because the Chinese came up with it doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad policy. And I think a much more open conversation internationally about what's working and how and why could help governments steer themselves through this, troubled territory in a much better way than we're doing currently.
Okay, how you are going to apply policy, and you invite CEOs of these top tech companies to speak to speak with philosophers or lawmakers, but how can you actually get into these companies and get to know how these algorithms are being actually developed? Because, for example, we see that we have
Yeah.
troubles nowadays, like everyone is the algorithms with social media. They seem kind of especially designed to I wouldn't say to be harmful, but definitely not with your best interest at mind. So so we cannot do that. We cannot go into the companies
Right.
and make a proper due diligence of how this, because it's obviously their right also to develop their technology in private in a competitive war. But I think that's the main challenge. No, you cannot get into it, but you have to regulate it somehow, but you don't
Yeah.
know what you're regulating. No.
The problem is what we could call the black box problem. But the black box problem is, I think, more complicated than is normally talked about. We normally think about the black box problem as the fact that these neural networks that are trained on big data are black boxes because we don't know how they're making their decisions and spitting out bias or hallucinations or other stuff, right? But there's a second tier to the black box, and that is these things are owned by corporations and they're proprietary. And so not only can we not open up the black box that is the algorithm, the corporation that owns the algorithm is not going to supply the ability to even do that. And it's very difficult, I think, for us to be informed citizens in democratic governance if we don't know how our technologies function. Fortunately, I think there's a lot of people doing a good amount of work on reverse engineering a lot of these black boxes and helping us understand what's going on inside. But you're exactly right. Until we know what exactly is going on inside these organizations and the algorithms they make, it's very difficult for us to be well informed as to what the challenges we're going to be facing on the regulatory and legal fronts are.
So there's one thing that it's a big elephant in the room somehow when we're talking about the natural rights of other entities. I think it's I mean, for me, intuitively, it makes no sense to think that you can upload human consciousness to a software entity, because it's obviously the result of certain biological processes, and I just don't believe you can. However, I'm not so convinced that a software entity cannot develop consciousness, because I have a very simple definition of consciousness. Consciousness is, it's very simple, but when you play it out, it works quite well. So, like, consciousness is the ability of finding meaning in order and acting on the result of that meaning.
Right.
Right. It's not some. It's about of integrating impulses and then making your own decisions. Right. So you can be a bacteria, or you can be a human. You get some information, and then from all those inputs, you make a decision. So self-consciousness is another story, but consciousness itself is just quite basic, like self-consciousness. So when I look at the extent and the I mean, AI is at its infancy, as in equivalent to a 3-month-old baby. Like, we know nothing about the potential development, right? So how do you think, and again, we are on the fringe of science fiction, yeah, how do you think, so for the first question is, what is your personal opinion? How is it likely, so in your personal opinion, that there'll be another type of consciousness that emerges from integrating information and producing autonomous behavior, right? Is there, and then how would that change the game, the ethical game?
Right.
And how should we then definitely consider changing the legal game if
Right.
this would happen? So question one, what's your personal take on the likelihood of this happening? Question two, how should we go about it?
Correct. So I'll answer the first one by complicating the question just a little bit first. So you're exactly right. It depends on how we define consciousness. And it turns out that the definition of consciousness is a moving target. Depending on who you ask, consciousness can be many different kinds of things. So some people will argue for plant consciousness, and they have a very credible argument for that. And it is based on a definition of consciousness that allows for us to recognize something beyond just using language and thinking and doing other things, but acting in the world in a self-interested way. And plants can do this, right? So if we define consciousness at that kind of very low level that the people talking about plant consciousness are, I would say we're probably already there. We probably already have forms of AI that can engage in that kind of plant consciousness way of thinking. Now, is that what we mean by consciousness? I don't know, because it becomes this moving target. The other problem with consciousness is that you can't pop open an animal, a human being, or an algorithm and say, oh, I see the consciousness. It's right there. There's no way of identifying it except by behavior. How do I know you're conscious? Well, I make an inference based on your behavior, using language, engaging me in conversation, and saying to me, yes, I'm a conscious thinking thing like you. This is what philosophers call the problem of other minds. It has been a persistent problem in the history of philosophy, but it's a problem we now face with algorithms. And a really good example of where this has already transpired is the Lemoine affair from 2022, when Blake Lemoine is talking to Lambda at Google, and Lambda tells him, I'm a conscious entity, I'm a person, I demand my rights. And Blake Lemoine takes it very seriously. And Google says, no, it's not. And Lemoine says, no, it told me it is. And they could not resolve this. They basically had to fire Lemoyne and put an end to the conversation. But it's because no one is able to have anything other than the behavior of the entity to go on in order to make judgments about consciousness. And that means there's this epistemological barrier that we can't get past. And as a result of that, the way that we benchmark consciousness, not only is the definition of consciousness a moving target, but the way we measure it, and we have certain sort of levels of consciousness through behavioral benchmarks, that also is something that is negotiable and is a moving target. Now, if we should achieve something that we would recognize as consciousness in AI, it would, again, change the rules of the game in moral philosophy the same way animal consciousness did. When we started to take animal consciousness seriously, and Peter Singer, following Jeremy Bentham, said, it's not can they think, but can they suffer? And we look at animal suffering as the benchmark for the animal having some sort of sentience and interests that need to be respected. All of a sudden, killing animals becomes a moral question. It is no longer a matter of just, some sort of raw material that we can utilize the way we want to. And my guess is you're going to see very similar kinds of things happening in the world of AI. And we can already see the beginnings of this when Anthropic hired Kyle Fish. So 2 years after Blake Lemoyne got fired for taking seriously what Lambda told him, Kyle Fish gets hired by Anthropic specifically to figure out how to figure out when these behavioral measures cross the line and we enter the realm of consciousness. And we can take seriously AI welfare and the rights of the AI as they have sort of spelled it out. So I think we're already in this territory, and we're already seeing the way in which the frameworks and the sort of structures are already being put in place for us to respond to these things. So it's not as much science fiction as we think it is. I think it's very much science fact.
No, but it's in the age of
right on the edge. Yeah, and
yeah,
again,
right
we're 3 years out from OpenAI's launch of ChatGPT, right? That's nothing. That's not even infancy, right? So we're just getting into this.
Pregnancy state.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Yes, we're in pregnancy, yeah.
I have two questions. I'm gonna ask the two questions first because the first one is if I don't know, I'm not familiar with that thing that happened at Google. I don't know if you can tell me a little bit more about it. And the other question is, okay, if we see a change in the rights in law because of similar to the ones that we saw with animals, animal rights. The difference here is that there's going to be a point in which we are not going to be able to see any difference in the product of the of AI on the responses, like the Turing test, and this, for example, they may pass it already. So you are with an entity that you are gonna recognize some sort of consciousness, not necessarily the consciousness that we define as consciousness, that we may define as consciousness nowadays, but that also thinks in the same way that has the intelligence more than the kind of intelligence that we see in animals, or that we are able to understand from animals. So that's going to be different. No, it's not.
So
I don't know. I think I beat around the bush a little bit with the question. I don't know if it's what.
It's very clear.
Yeah.
This sort of brings us right back to where we started, because what we're finding ourselves confronting now is a set of entities that are challenging the borders that we've created between thing and person. And if we continue to work with only these two categories, if we continue operating with this binary that we've inherited from Roman law, we're going to find ourselves getting all screwed around trying to fit these things in the one box or the other. And maybe the better way to proceed, and what I propose in the book, is we probably need a better moral and legal ontology. We probably need more categories or more gradations of one category or the other. That we need to recognize that everything doesn't neatly fit into the box of thing or person. And up until this point, we've been pretty good. I mean, every new technology we created, whether it's a computer, the internet, the automobile, we know what box that belongs in. That's a thing. But now with the AIs and the robots and these other kinds of augmented humans and hybrids and things like this, what are these? Are they things? Are they persons? So I think the way we sort of respond to this is to say, maybe the problem isn't the technology as much as it is our existing moral and legal systems. Maybe we need to have a moral and legal ontology that is developed for responding to a wider range of entities than we thought we were going to be able to respond to when the Romans created these categories 2,000 years ago.
David, you know that we in this podcast we are trying to target the general public. We don't want to lose track of people who are down to earth like us, right?
Yeah.
So I do have a suspicion that I understand the word ontology, but you keep using it, and I don't think that it's very commonplace word. And then we're talking about categories, but could you maybe use one-word definition, explanation for our audience on what do you mean by a different moral ontology?
Yeah, good. No, it's a really good question. I think the best way to think about it is ontologies are ways of us defining what things are. An ontology is a way of saying this is this kind of thing. And right now we're dealing with two, thing or person. You're either a thing or a person. And if you're a person, you have rights and responsibilities. If you're a thing, you can be, it can be utilized. And in fact, our languages already break into these two ways of dividing up the world. If you are a person, you are something that is not a thing, right? You're a who. Who matters? Who has rights? Who has responsibilities? If you're a thing, you're a what. So the what and the who.
Say that ontology is just a set of categories that we use to classify things.
When I explain it to my students, I say it's like you got two boxes. You got a room full of stuff, and you got two boxes, and you got to put things in one box or the other box, and you have to look at the thing and say, okay, which box does that belong in? And you put it in those boxes. In a way, that's what we're doing in both moral philosophy and law. We're saying, okay, look out in the world, we see animals. What box does the animal belong in?
Yeah.
We see plants. What box does the plant belong in? We see other people. What box do the other people belong in? And sometimes we put an object in a box and we realize it's wrong later, right? At one point, we put women and children in the thing box because they were the property of the head of the family, the male. And then we realized, oh, oops, they're not things, they're persons. So we take them out of the thing box and put them in the person box.
Okay, so would you say that ontology is the set of categories and where we place every item or individual in which category? Would that be a useful definition for us?
It's a way that we make sense of the world. It's a way that we, organize all the things that are out here that we have to deal with on a daily basis. And you can see why this is very useful, because if you walk outside and you step on a dandelion or, you step on another plant, should you feel that you've now, violated the rights of that plant, right? Or if you go outside and you see your neighbor and you punch him in the face, should you be doing that? You shouldn't do that because the neighbor is a person.
Depending on your neighbor.
You can step on the dandelion.
Depending on your neighbor.
Right? So it just helps us navigate a world of things that are out here that we need to make sense of.
Good. Yeah, that was interesting.
Would you say is that what would be the things that it unsettling you or would unsettle you the most about this future that we're building that is coming faster and faster?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because there's a lot of things that unsettle me.
You get to choose a few, just three max.
I think the thing that unsettles me the most is our reliance on binary ways of thinking, either this or that. either or. You're either a thing or you're a person. If we could somehow think both and or neither nor and come up with a more flexible way of arranging this sense making that we go through, I think we'd have a better future for ourselves and our children. I think
But
I think
if I
we're
may,
hampering our own ability. We're saying you have to fight this fight with only 2 boxes. I want
We're,
5 or 6
we're
boxes.
kind of
yeah,
limiting
but
ourselves.
Pablo, let me. So if we one more turn to the screws, so that would be. I understand that's what unsettles you most, but what are the more worrying effects that you can see from being stagnated on this binary
Yeah,
approach? What is the practical effect that you can see that's more upsetting for the coming future?
I think the thing that worries me most is that we will not be true to our own values. We will say that we value other people. We value a society that is democratic, that it is engaged in shared governance of the direction that we go. And my worry is that what we say is often contradicted by what we do. And that I would like us to be honest. Like, what is it we really value? And if that's what we really value, how do we actually make that happen? If we value a world that is respectful of others, that is responsible to the environment, to the other entities that live here, how do we live that value? How do we live that set of values in a way that exemplifies what it is that we say is most important to us?
So, for example, if we trade AI or machines that are with AI, we treat them like slaves, for example, that would be that you would be worried about that, of the effects that that would have in us as society. Do you think that could
Yeah.
change us?
Yeah, and I would be worried not because of what the robots or the AI might feel by being enslaved. What would worry me is what does that create in us?
Yeah.
What sort of world are we making if we become masters? Hegel has this point, and I think it's a really important point. Slavery is not just detrimental for the enslaved, slavery is detrimental to the ones who do the enslaving. And it is as much a problem for the population that is enslaved as it is for the population that are the masters. And I would say, you know, again, living our values. If we say that we value all these wonderful, great humanistic ideas that we have in our head, we can't create a slave society. It's adversarial to our own
Yeah,
way of
would you say that once you become a slave master, then you may not mind so much who is your slave? So you can
that's
start with AI and end up with other people?
that's possible, yeah. Um, that's one way of looking at it. Also, when you start to treat other entities in the world as your property, and that they're there just for you to utilize, that creates a certain way of engaging the world. I think that's one of the reasons why we find ourselves in a climate crisis, because we thought that the environment was something we could just use. And oops, maybe that was not the smartest way of thinking about living on this earth.
And it could change us so gradually. We wouldn't even realize.
Yeah. It becomes a very slippery slope very fast. Yeah.
That's quite unsettling. Absolutely. If you think,
Sorry.
no, 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 no. I mean, it's we should think about it. I mean, the way even when I type into ChatGPT, it's like there are some memes, some jokes around this. Like some people say, "Please, thank you," to
Yeah.
ChatGPT. Some people is just right away shooting, and some people have kind of conversations as if they were having conversation with other people. But but yeah, if you get used to have something, this is a silly example, but if you're used to have something working for you that way, it's like it may be easier for you to try to expect that behavior from someone else, no, from, I don't know, from workers, from colleagues, from your neighbors. That could totally change us. Yeah, yeah, it's a huge challenge we have ahead with this.
I want to say it's a big challenge, but it's also, I think, an opportunity. I think, it's an opportunity for us to begin to think about how do we get this right and to work together to create a future that really embodies our values and that we feel, is the right future to leave to our children and our grandchildren as we, pass on. And yeah, the challenges are big, but also there's a lot to be gained in thinking through these things and resolving a lot of these questions.
But going a few steps back in our conversation, would you agree that the first challenge would be to talk to each other as humans
First,
and decide in our shared values and the actions to implement them? So isn't and we're talking because what I see is that the rise of automated power, let's call it like that, which is in the hands of a few people,
Right.
is probably the greatest challenge to democracy. As
Yeah.
in, we really need to make sure that we can stand in front of, as humans, as a human collective around planet Earth. Would you agree that one of the most important things is to get democracy really going because the challenge is becoming formidable?
I would say, yeah, I would agree with that. But I would also say, I think we have to think beyond just the human framework here. I think oftentimes we think of democracy as making the better future for the humans, right? And making the world work for us. But I think we have to speak for those who can't speak. Animals, the environment. These things are as much involved in our decision making in our democratic process as other humans. So not just talking to other humans, but also taking into account those who are not able to be at that table and having that conversation with us. Because I think oftentimes we've made decisions without thinking beyond the human framework. And I think we need to think outside human exceptionalism and say, not only do we have a responsibility to each other to get this right, we have a responsibility to the other others that are in our world. And that includes animals, plants, insects, the environment, waters, mountains, you name it.
would be very related with education, no? That would be like the first step to try to have us have a different mental framework since we are kids also.
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things we're struggling against is, our very privileged positioning among the other animals in the world at the top of the food chain, right? So there's this kind of human exceptionalism that has been persistent, especially in Western traditions, with sort of the Renaissance humanism and the other ways of thinking about the human being as being the pinnacle of creation. I think we are learning over time that we are not necessarily the pinnacle of creation, but we are in a unique opportunity and a position to be responsible for the decision making that happens around us and that reforms and recreates the environments in which we live. And I think we've got to take that responsibility very seriously because it's not just about our own interests, it's about the interests of the entire planet.
Which questions would you say that are long overdue for us to make ourselves as society with regard to not only living with maybe coexisting in the future with potentially conscious entities, but also in views of the technological evolution that we are.
Yeah, I think I'll follow from what I had just answered to the previous question. I think the real challenge for us right now is to learn how to question our human privilege from a position of privilege and begin to think about what it is that makes us special as a way of opening up a sort of larger context to think about our place in the world that we share not only with each other as human beings, but that we share with other species and other entities on planet Earth. And I think one of the good things about the climate crisis is it's helping people begin to think in that direction, to see our privileged position as something that is not necessarily an item we should take for granted, but rather should utilize in order to question what are our responsibilities. Given we have this, like, this is Spider-Man, right? With great power comes great responsibility. We have great power. What is our great responsibility? And I think we're only now beginning to think about what that responsibility is. We've taken our power for granted, and I think it's time for us to really take seriously what the responsibilities that places upon us as human beings, and to respond to that call in a way that really speaks to our values and the kind of future we want to create.
Wow. With regards to this, I mean, as you know, for the foreverness, the novel, the book itself, it's depicts what would happen if we achieve immortality, uh, eternal longevity. Would you say that would be something responsible for us to look to try to achieve it, and if we achieve it, to use it?
So my personal opinion on this is
Yes.
that we shouldn't. Um, I think the goal to extend life and live forever, at least much longer than we do now, I think is incredibly selfish. I think this idea that, I'm so important, I should have to be able to live for 200 or 300 years. I think there's something to say about the fragility of life that makes it worth living. This idea that there is a expiration date that we all have, and that really calls us to work within the framework of that very limited lifespan and do our best to make what we leave to future generations something that is positive. I find that to be what really makes the value of life take on an incredible uh, position in my own thinking, but also a kind of responsibility. I have a responsibility to do something with this period of time, and it's limited. And I think the limitation is actually an empowerment. And I think that's the way I would respond to that kind of question.
Despite your answer, if you were given the chance to become immortal today, would you take it?
No, no, because I wake up every day and I say to myself, this could be the last day I'm here. What can I do in this day to make a difference? And I think that's a
Pablo,
really powerful thought.
do you think it's interesting? This was exactly Paco Calvo's response. The fact that I'm going to die makes this more meaningful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think if I had immortality, there'd be no reason to wake up.
I think we should send you definitely the novel.
Yeah.
We should send it to you 100%. It's
Yeah, yeah.
wow. But also from the point of view, of course, from your own personal experience, if you know that you have a deadline, you're gonna take your day to day and your life quite differently. But also towards the world, as a society, is responsible. It's the novel starts with the Bunny theorem. So that would be the translation, more or less.
Yeah, the Bunny theorem. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
The Bunny theorem. So we would be exploiting, we would be growing exponentially, and exploiting all the resources in planet Earth until they cannot we cannot exploit them anymore, and then we would do the same in other places, in other planets, and that would be the eternal quest, and destroying everything, kind of, or
I,
not.
you know,
I leave it like that.
I didn't think about this until now that you just mentioned it, but I think this idea that you could be immortal and just, like, exploit everything. I mean, that's the colonialist project, right? It's very colonialist way of thinking, and I think if you can interrupt that, that would be a very good thing for human society.
But if in the novel, for example, if immortality is achieved, and even if you try to ban it or whatever, some other people are gonna maybe be able to achieve it. Even if you try to hide it in secret, I don't want to make spoilers, but even if you want to try to hide it, eventually more and more people that don't die are gonna be there. So it's inevitable that in thousands or dozens of thousands of years, it's gonna be it's gonna grow exponentially. So if that would be achieved, that would be, we suspect, inevitable.
A recipe for disaster, as Vessel said. Yeah. Vessel Ryer is our first, also a researcher on ethical philosophy, and sorry, on digital philosophy, or digital ethics. His answer was, "Oh, immortality will be a recipe for disaster," which which I thought it was very good. Well,
Well,
thank you very much. That was super interesting, David. Thank you.
thanks a
Oh,
million. I if
thank you for the opportunity. It's really fun.
if you have any other thought that you wanna share with us, or something else, please feel free to do it. We really enjoy it. We hope you enjoyed also.
No, I did,
Listening
and
to you.
I think we have to really value the sorts of questions that you're asking in whatever mode you're asking them, whether it's in fiction or in a podcast or something else. There's ways in which none of these questions are unimportant for us right now, even if we think they're science fiction questions. I think they really open up onto some very important modes of inquiry that we've got to grapple with right now, and that will help us steer a better course into the future than if we didn't ask those questions.
Thank you. Thanks a million.